November 11, 1918 marked the end of the First World War. It was a day that the German army on one hand and the Allied army of Britain, France, and other powers on the other hand signed the armistice that marked the end of over 4 years of fighting on the battlefield of France, the Western Front. It was one of history's worst wars, although the Second World War was even worse than the first. While the First World War lasted for 4 years from 1914 to 1918, the Second World War lasted for 6 years from 1939 to 1945. So, what was Nigeria's business with these wars? The First World War was as a result of a disagreement between European powers, which directly or indirectly involved Africa. Campaigns were done on African soil, and over 1 million soldiers or even more were involved in these campaigns that significantly had implications in Africa. Women and children were forcibly recruited to act as carriers. They would carry the supply of the military who could not move their supplies through roads, animals, or rails. When the enlistment drive ended in September 1919, about 2,000 enlisted carriers, 35,000 non-enlisted carriers, and 17,000 combatants were made to participate in the German East Africa and Southern Cameroons campaign. About 150,000 soldiers lost their lives in the war, while others were left injured and disabled. By the end of the war, most African countries had chosen a side. The French, Italian, British, Portuguese, and Belgian administrations were allied against the German colonies. The colonies had also participated chiefly in the war. They had gone to fight in lands far away from their home. The French also made use of their colonies in Africa. There were combatants and non-combatants who had been enlisted. This had a different impact on the country's workforce. The Nigerian Regiment was a group of Nigerian soldiers who, in September 1914, supplied shock troops to the Cameroon's Expeditionary Force. They fought the German army with British soldiers. There was also Nigeria's overseas contingent who, in December 1917, campaigned in Tanganyika. The British had conscripted Nigerians along the northern and eastern borders for military service. The war had an economic impact on Nigeria. Nigeria's raw materials were at Britain's disposal, which encouraged them to wage war. They also supplied troops for the campaigns held within Africa, the campaigns against German East Africa and German Cameroon. The First World War was an important phase in Nigeria's history. The war had a significant consequence for the country. The veterans who served in the war became catalysts for change on their arrival back home. They were more enlightened and their mental horizons were broadened. Their language, attitude, and ideas had been altered by the war. Their adaptation to change compelled others to follow suit. Also, 2 years after the armistice had been signed in 1920, the National Congress for British West Africa was created in Accra to campaign for African rights. Lagos, 2 years after, in 1922, drafted a new constitution which allowed for the elected Nigerian representatives to sit in the Legislative Council of the Governor-General. It is believed that the aftermath of the First World War initiated the modern nationalist movement. Often described as a European war, the Second World War caused great destruction to people and world societies. After France fell, the British reached out to other Commonwealth nations like Canada, South Africa, Australia, and India to help them as they continued the fight. They also had the full backing of their colonies. The Ututu Clan Executive Committee of the southeastern part of Nigeria on September 3, 1939, when Neville Chamberlain declared war on Germany, pledged their loyalty to the monarchy of the British Empire. They wrote, "Though we are but poor farmers by trade, we are quite prepared to render any assistance which may come to our reach to our British government, which is fighting for world peace." Local leaders had called for an opportunity to unite and fight against the common enemy to defeat Adolf Hitler. Oba Akenzua II of Benin advocated that Nigerians bury all differences and use their resources to defend Nigeria and Britain. The newspapers such as the West African Pilot and Nigerian Daily Times also aided in gaining support from Nigerians as regards the war. In short, the general Nigerian population were ready to donate their funds and resources towards the war. In 1948, Arthur Richards, the Governor General of Nigeria, attested to the generous contributions of Nigeria to the Second World War. The Nigerian population as a British colony were not mere spectators. They effectively participated and fought in the war. However, history has neglected the important roles African colonies played for their colonial masters in the war. Nigerian soldiers, mostly the Hausas and Yorubas, were enlisted to fight for the British Empire. Their agricultural products were also not spared, especially when Japan cut off Asia from supplies when they entered the war. The British regulated internal and external trade in Nigeria to increase production for export. The two world wars drafted millions of Africans to fight against German imperialism. They fought for the freedom of the Allied powers when they were barely free from the shackles of their European colonial masters. The Africans, especially Nigeria, had no business with the wars, but they fought regardless. However, the Second World War was beneficial to Africans. They gained military knowledge, improved communication skills, and self-confidence that they would later use to gain their independence. Nigeria too was not left out. After a series of constitutional conferences, the country eventually gained its independence on Saturday, October 1st, 1960. You can check out the full story in our next episode.